Hey there, friends, David here, and now that we've seen A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms sort of play up the liberty-minded tendencies of House Baratheon by presenting Lyonel, the Laughing Storm, as a kind of forerunner for Robert and his rebellion, I thought it would be fun to review the most rebellious and difficult, recalcitrant, warlike Baratheons and Durrandons in A Song of Ice and Fire history. You know, all the wars and rebellions that Storm's End has either started or played a central role in. From Duran Godsgrief to the Andal invasion to a couple of vulture hunts down in the Dornish Mountains to Robert's rebellion to that one time that Gendry was really stubborn. I'm kidding about Gendry, but he's still got time to make the list, you know. Keep your eye on him, because whether it's rebelling against the crown or defending your homeland against conquest, you can be sure that the Baratheons will be right there at the front of the line, on the front line. Hammer at the ready. That's right. Say hello to Big Yellow. This is either a nasty looking or just a beautifully worn hammer. It's what I got. I don't have a warhammer. And these aren't real antlers either. I'm sorry to shatter the illusion. But let me tell you, there are definitely more rebellious Baratheons than you think. There were a lot more than I thought going into writing this script, but we'll try to move fast. Obviously, Robert, who has a rebellion named after him, is the first one that comes to mind, but even his brothers Renly and Stannis also took up arms against the Iron Throne and one another. Then we have Lyonel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, and this will be a spoiler alert for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms season, 6 or 7. Well, he launches a brief rebellion against the crown later in his, about 3 decades after the Hedge Knight, for reasons that we'll discuss, and which are definitely not just Lyonel wanted to play tug of war with Dunk some more. Before him, we had Argilac the Arrogant, whose legendary defiance of Aegon the Conqueror culminated in a battle called the Last Storm, where Orys Baratheon, the first Baratheon, defeated Argilac and then stole his flair. Then during the Dance of the Dragons, and I'm sure you'll remember this because we saw it on House of the Dragon Season 1, Boros Baratheon turned his back on his father's pledge to support Rhaenyra's claim to the Iron Throne and sided with Aegon II and Team Green. Somewhat capriciously and on the spot, I will add, and this of course led directly to the disaster at Storm's End where Lucerys and Arrax were chomped by Vhagar and Aemond, which in turn kicked off the war. So, nice one, Lord Boros. And we'll actually see Lord Boros fight in the war this season on House of the Dragon. Don't forget Rogar Baratheon, he's a real stick in the mud. He resisted Maegor and Jaehaerys and caused a lot more trouble than you may remember. And he even has his very own war named after him as well. Of course, it did all start with Durrandon Godsgrief, who defied the very gods of the Stormlands themselves. And some of the Durrandon Storm Kings who came after were also forces to be reckoned with in their own right. Kings such as Durrandon III, who invaded Dorne not once, but twice, and was defeated by Princess Nymeria herself. Or King Durrandon the 21st, who made something called the Weirwood Alliance with the Children of the Forest to resist the Andals. That's pretty cool. And then wait till you hear about this guy called Sir Ronard the Bastard, who I completely forgot about. He was a real handful and is something of a dark horse contender for most troublesome Baratheon. There's just something about wearing antlers on your head that makes you want to go to war. I don't want to go to war, but they do. The Baratheons do. They often go to war. And what we're going to do today is to go through these in historical order first, and then at the end of the episode, we will rate them to crown Westeros' most troublesome and recalcitrant Baratheon. So jab that thumbs up button with your antler prongs while the music plays, and I wish you good fortune in the video to come. All right, so it really does start at the beginning with Durrandon the First, called the Godsgrief, and not just because of his... had the brilliant idea to use a different lighter this time. Not just because he is the very defiant and warlike founder of House Durrandon, which he is, but because of the way that George uses the Godsgrief legend to frame the story of Stannis, Renly, and Robert. So this happens in A Clash of Kings as Lady Catelyn is on her way to Storm's End to try to intervene between Renly and Stannis Baratheon, who are ready to go to war with each other, when they might instead join their forces, even join their forces with Robb, and defeat the Lannisters. So essentially what happens is that Catelyn begins recalling to herself the legend of Duran Godsgrief and his famous defiance of the gods, just as she is coming in sight of Storm's End on the way to the parlay. And then we get I don't remember how many pages it is, but it's 2 or 3 pages at least of solid Duran Godsgrief mythology info dump. By the time Catelyn reaches the parlay between Renly and Stannis, the reader has gotten the message. These Baratheons are legendary levels of stubborn. Now, people have definitely sort of poked fun at the way that George gives his great houses these sort of permanent personality types, and then has almost all of their members to some degree or another follow that archetype, such as all these recalcitrant and unruly Baratheons. It kind of goes along with the fantasy world genetics that last, forever and ever, the Golden Lannisters. And so yeah, the personality types last forever too. What George is doing is basically creating an oversimplified fantasy world version of the way that different cultures in the real world prioritize different values and ways of living, and in turn have cultures, customs, and legends and beliefs that reflect those values. In other words, all the Baratheons being stubborn and warlike and kind of drunken and debaucherous. It's a little bit like Irish people like to drink and fight, and I apologize to our Irish audience if I just did a racism. Obviously, it is a little bit out of style, so to speak, to overgeneralize and characterize cultures in this way. But in terms of what George is doing with the story, it does sort of help the story gel if we kind of know when a Baratheon rides onto the screen, he's going to stir shit up and bow to no one and probably drink heavily. As for the Duran Godsgrief legend itself, it is really just the Monty Python routine. Everyone said it was daft to build a castle in a swamp, so I built it all the same. It sank into the swamp. So I built a second one. That sank into the swamp. So I built a third one. That burned down, fell over, and then sank into the swamp. But the fourth one stayed up. And the guy kind of looks like he could be a Baratheon. So, this all fits. Except that with Duran, it was building a castle on the tip of a storm-racked peninsula instead of in a swamp. And it was the storms that kept destroying the castle. There were also 7 castles instead of 4, although that's likely a post-Andal conquest change to the story. The bottom line is that it's a story about defiance and strength. So the idea of Duran defying the storms in a literal physical sense by building the castle there is overlaid with this more mythical story about Duran stealing the daughter of the wind and sea gods, fair Elenai. It's the same story though, because when the wind and the sea mate, the wind and the sea god, when they mate, who is their child? What do the wind and sea make when they get together? They make storms. And you can just ask Godric Borel, lord of nearby Sweet Sister.
Storms were sacred on the sisters before the Andals came. Our gods of old were the lady of the waves and the lord of the skies. They made storms every time they mated.
And so yes, as the daughter of the wind and sea deities, Elenai represents the storm, which is the child of the wind and the sea. And that fits very well with Duran Godsgrief having stolen the power of the storm, because after triumphing over these storms sent by the gods, he himself becomes the Storm Lord, as if he has stolen their storm power, which again is represented by Elenai, daughter of the wind. You guys see how this works. In similar fashion, the ancient Durrandon may have stolen the power of the green men and or the children of the forest, who may or may not be the same thing or related things. Meaning that the ancient Durrandon dress up like stag people because they want to claim the power of the green men, who were perceived as godlike in some of Westeros' very oldest legends. Now, the histories tell us that Duran Godsgrief, the first Durrandon king, he also claimed the Rainwood. That's the huge forest just south of Storm's End, which we know contains wild weirwoods to this day, and is said to have been a stronghold of the Children of the Forest when they had already disappeared from other parts of Westeros. Then Duran Godsgrief's son comes along. He's called Duran the Devout, and he supposedly gave the Rainwood back to the Children of the Forest. So that title Devout probably means devout to the old gods. But then about a century later, another Duran comes along called Duran Bronzeaxe, and as his name would imply, he is not a fan of the Children of the Forest, so he took the Rainwood back from the children, and it is said that the Baratheons have owned it since then. Owned it. I don't know how much they own a wild forest, but sure. So it's hard to sort out exactly what's going on here. This is very old history, and Duran Godsgrief, in some legends, is said to have gotten the help of the children to build his castle. So it's likely that this is a similar situation as we see elsewhere in Westeros with the First Men, where at times they are warring on the children, but eventually coming to adopt their religion and customs. And so there you have it. Our very first rebellious and warlike Baratheon is a Durrandon, and he is Duran Godsgrief, who defied the gods. He set the template for all of these rebellious Durrandon and Baratheons to come. Speaking of which, let's talk about some of those Durrandon kings. All right, let's talk about the Durrandon, as in the other Durrandon kings besides Duran Godsgrief, because several of them are quite recalcitrant and warlike. So after Duran Bronzeaxe, the next Durrandon that we hear of is Duran the Dour, who slew Lund the Last, king of the giants, at the Battle of Crookwater. Although scholars still do debate whether that was Duran the Fifth or Duran the Sixth, because that's an important difference. Point is, slaying the king of the giants sounds pretty tough. And then next we have Duran the Young, also known as the Butcher Boy, who dammed the river Slain with Dornish corpses after turning back Yoren Ironwood and the warrior maid Willa of Will in the battle by the Bloody Pool. And he sounds pretty tough, too. It was, of course, Monfred the First Durrandon, Monfred the Mighty, who first expanded the Durrandon holdings north of the River Trident, defeating the petty kings of House Darkland and House Mutin in a series of wars, and seizing the prosperous port towns of Duskendale and Maidenpool. He's called Monfred the Mighty, so you know he's a problem on the battlefield. And he's continuing in a growing list of Storm Kings who steadily expand their holdings by warring on people and taking their shit, following in the footsteps of Duran Godsgrief himself, who stole Elenai and the power of the storm, as we discussed. So then we come to Ronard the Bastard. He is a hard MFer, and he was, as his name suggests, the bastard half-brother of King Morden Durrandon II, whom he usurped with the help of their sister, whom Ronard married. And then we are told that he ruled for nigh unto 30 years as Ronard the Bastard, smashing rebel bannermen and petty kings alike in battle after battle. Never a man to confine himself to a single woman. He claimed a daughter from every foe who bent the knee. By the time he died, he had supposedly fathered 99 sons. So basically, King Ronard is a lot like King Robert. He's a usurper king, but even hornier, even more given to debauchery, and potentially even more warlike. And then we come to the Andal invasion, and there are a few Durrandon kings who do sort of okay, but they're steadily losing ground. That is until a pair of Durrandon kings come along who think outside the box a little bit, and one of them uses the greed of the Andals against them, and then his son does something even more unusual. King Baldric I Durrandon, the Cunning, proved expert at setting them one against the other. And King Duran the 21st took the unprecedented step of seeking out the remaining children of the forest in the caves and hollow hills where they had taken refuge, and making common cause with them against the men from beyond the sea. In the battles fought at Black Bog, in the Misty Wood, and beneath the Howling Hill, the precise location of which has sadly been lost, this Weirwood alliance dealt the Andals a series of stinging defeats, and checked the decline of the Storm Kings for a time. Alright, so it certainly seems like Duran the 21st here was probably thinking of the legend of the last hero and how he sought out the children of the forest when he was hard-pressed, and how the children helped the first men of the Night's Watch to rally and win the War for the Dawn. And would you look at that, he got pretty good results. So, score one for the wet nurse's fables. Now, ultimately, the Andals were not able to be held off, but they never conquered Storm's End. Apparently they tried, and after failing 7 times, they took it as a sign from the gods and quit trying. So give the castle some points for being stubborn. Then, as generations went by and things ultimately settled down, the Durrandon kings ended up intermarrying with the local Andal kings, which is fake history written to mimic the Saxon conquest of an integration with Celtic Britain. So here we get to give a little, or perhaps a big shout out to Sir Arlen of Pennytree, who carries his own sort of warhammer, boom, because, kidding aside, we must now speak seriously of Arlen Durrandon, King Arlen I Durrandon, and King Arlen III. I'm not sure what Arlen II was doing, but it didn't get him famous. House Durrandon reached its greatest heights in the epoch that followed. During the Age of the 100 Kingdoms, King Arlen I, the Avenger, swept all before him, extending the borders of his kingdom as far as the Blackwater Rush and the headwaters of the Mander. His great-grandson, King Arlen III, crossed both the Blackwater and the Trident and claimed the Riverlands in their entirety, at one point planting his crowned stag banner on the shores of the Sunset Sea. So that's pretty boss, right? Expanding the Storm Storm Kingdom all the way across clear to the other coast, so the Stormlanders can compare notes on wind and sea god theology with the Ironborn. And then the Riverlanders are over here like, hey, we believe in watery halls too. But Arlen III Durrandon claimed the Riverlands in their entirety, so I'm pretty sure that includes the watery halls of any local rivers. Arlen III also wed a daughter of Lord Blackwood in an old god's wedding ceremony in front of their half-dead heart tree, so I bet those antlers looked pretty right in the godswood. And that brings us to Argilac the Arrogant. Alright, so our final Durrandon king on the list is the final Durrandon king period, and that, of course, is the provocatively named Argilac the Arrogant. He's the one who had the brilliant idea to send Aegon the Conqueror the severed hands of his envoy in a box, and turned out to be wrong. It wasn't a brilliant idea, it was dumb. Dumb idea, bad, but it was stubborn. This wasn't rebellion, but rather defending his holdings against an invading conqueror. He sure helped stir the pot, though, and not just with the severed hands. And by the way, you should never stir your pot with severed hands or other body parts. It's disgusting, and it's also a health code violation. So the World of Ice and Fire calls Duran's pot stirring grasping the dragon by the tail, and also attempting to use House Targaryen of Dragonstone as a shield against the growing might of the Iron Men and their king, Harren the Black. And so yes, feeling pressed by the ever-increasing and recent conquests of Black Harrenhor, Argilac decided to make some moves. No king in Westeros felt more threatened than Argilac, the Storm King, last of the Durrandon, an aging warrior whose only heir was his maiden daughter. Thus it was that King Argilac reached out to the Targaryens on Dragonstone, offering Lord Aegon his daughter in marriage, with all the lands east of the God's Eye from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush as her dowry. So then it goes on to emphasize that what Argilac was obviously trying to do was to establish the Targaryens as a kind of buffer zone along the Blackwater Rush between the lands of the Storm King and the lands of Black Harren. There were a couple of problems with that, though. First of which was that Aegon already had 2 wives and didn't need a third, and also the fact that the dower lands being offered had belonged to Harrenhal for more than a generation. They were not Argilac's to give. So that was a bit of a fly in the ointment. You know, basically, go conquer yourself those lands and then you can have them. Thanks, Argilac. And actually, Aegon countered with a pretty decent offer. He would take those lands that Argilac named, plus a few more that Argilac did own, and to seal the alliance with Team Aegon, it was going to be Aegon's bastard half-brother and best friend and right-hand man, Orys Baratheon, who would be betrothed to Argilac's daughter. I say this is a decent offer because it would have ensured that the Stormlanders wouldn't be standing alone against Black Harren, but rather alongside Aegon and his sisters and their dragons. And then he would also have a marriage secured for his daughter that would put him in tight with the new, authority in the area. But the problem is that Argilac would have had to swear fealty to Aegon and acknowledge him as his, higher lord or king, and he just wasn't down with that. And so that's when he cut off the hands of the messenger, put him in a box, sent him back to Aegon, and in doing so, essentially volunteered the Stormlands as the first target of Aegon's conquesting. You do have to admire Aegon's sense of, cosmic rightness or perhaps just irony in sending Orys Baratheon to take by force from Argilac what could have been rendered up cooperatively. Aegon also sent Rhaenys and Meraxes, of course, who made a huge difference in the battle called the Last Storm. Despite the fact that the wind and rain actually grounded Meraxes, a dragon fighting on the ground is still a problem. And Rhaenys and Meraxes also helped flush out the lords Fell, Errol, and Buckler, who had been raiding Orys Baratheon on the line of march from the nearby woods. So ultimately, Argilac Durrandon, who had for a time arrested the decline of the Storm Kingdom, who had turned back a Dornish invasion when he was but a boy, who had once crossed the Narrow Sea to join in the Great Alliance against the imperialist Tigers of Volantis, and who had slain Garce the Seventh Gardener, King of the Reach, in the Battle of Summerfield, chose to ride forth and meet the Targaryen armies in the field instead of being roasted in his castle like Black Harren had just recently been. And word of the Harrenhal disaster basically got to Storm's End, and he said, yeah, we're going to ride out and face these guys in the field. Argilac's forces outnumbered the armies of Rhaenys and Orys Baratheon 2-1, and they had 4 times as many mounted knights. The Targaryen forces, however, got to the high ground first. They set up shop on some hills near Storm's End. So if you know the dynamics of the Battle of Gettysburg, it's much like that. And just like at the Battle of Gettysburg, this left Argilac to try to charge up the hill in the middle of a driving rainstorm, which was very difficult. And in fact, it proved too muddy for the cavalry, the horses, to charge up the hill. Argilac did lead multiple charges, though, and eventually, with spearmen and infantry, they were able to take the hills. But on the last hill, as they were coming to the crest, of course, they came face to face with the dragon Meraxes. Yet still, Argilac continued to battle. When Orys Baratheon came down the muddy hill with his own men, he found the old king holding off half a dozen men with as many corpses at his feet.
"Stand aside,"
Baratheon commanded. He dismounted so as to meet the king on equal footing and offered the Storm King one last chance to yield. Argilac cursed him instead. And so they fought, the old warrior king with his streaming white hair and Aegon's fierce black-bearded hand. Each man took a wound from the other, it was said, but in the end, the last of the Durrandon got his wish and died with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. The death of their king took all the heart out of the Stormlanders, and as the word spread that Argilac had fallen, his lords and knights threw down their swords and fled. And there you have it. Rest in peace, Argilac Durrandon, the last of the Storm Kings. But wait! For a few days, it was feared that Storm's End might suffer the same fate as Harrenhal. For Argilac's daughter Argella barred her gates at the approach of Orys Baratheon and the Targaryen host, and declared herself the Storm Queen. Rather than bend the knee, the defenders of Storm's End would die to the last man, she promised when Queen Rhaenys flew Meraxes into the castle to parley. "You may take my castle, but you will win only bones and blood and ashes," she announced. But the soldiers of the garrison proved less eager to die. That night, they raised a peace banner, threw open the castle gate, and delivered Lady Argella gagged, chained, and naked to the camp of Orys Baratheon. So there you go. That was certainly rebellious and also a little kinky. I don't know if George meant to write it that way. And of course, the main thing is that Orys treated her kindly. It is said that Baratheon unchained her with his own hands, wrapped his cloak around her, poured her wine, and spoke to her gently, telling her of her father's courage and the manner of his death. And afterward, to honor the fallen king, he took the arms and words of the Durrandon for his own. The crowned stag became his sigil, Storm's End became his seat, and Lady Argella his wife. So I did a longer video to flesh out the potential plot lines of the Aegon's Conquest movie or show, whichever it turns out to be. And I definitely zeroed in on this Orys Argella dynamic as one of the more interesting things that they could flesh out. Like, what was their relationship like? This woman sounds like she is full of piss and vinegar, like all the other Baratheons. So you know this was an interesting relationship. And also, what were the negotiations like? Did she really fall for Orys, or was she just doing the politically expedient thing? Was she forced against her will? We just don't know. The Maesters don't tell us. And so there you have it, the last Storm King and Storm Queen, respectively. And that brings us to Orys Baratheon himself. All right, it's time to talk about Orys One Hand. Finally, a Baratheon on the list of most rebellious Baratheons. That's nice. And Orys Baratheon is, of course, the founder of House Baratheon. And although he is quite warlike, as we just read, he's actually a bit of a conformist, and therefore kind of a disappointment, in my opinion. I mean, he did fight in several wars. That's a lot more than I've done. I just wear the fake antlers. But he only did that on order of the king that he served, Aegon the Conqueror, who was his true-born half-brother and best friend. Orys was even Aegon's Hand of the King, which, how much more conformist could you be? Sure, I mean, yeah, he did defeat the old Storm King in a famous battle, but only with the help of a dragon lord and her dragon, you know? And then what did he do afterward? He started cosplaying as that very Storm King, adopting his house colors, his house words, his coat of arms, and the cool antler hats. And look, you can't blame him for wearing the antler hats. They're fun. They're a lot of fun. You should try it. But the point is, this man is neither rebellious nor independent, nor particularly recalcitrant. I mean, what were his old coat of arms and house where I just tossed him out in the garbage and just took on a whole new idea. He's a poser. He's a poser. That's what we used to call him in the 90s. I guess they're a try-hard now. Or I don't know. I don't, let me know. I'm old. What do the kids say instead of poser? But jokes aside, serious analysis here. It's actually a good thing that he was not overly stubborn and rebellious. Because the only way he could be accepted as a legitimate ruler of the Stormlands was by honoring their traditions. It's the thing that Danny talks about, putting on the floppy ears if a man wants to be king of the rabbits. Antler hats, by the way, much cooler than floppy ears. It was probably also wise and obviously honorable to, meet Argilac Durrandon in single combat. Compare that to Bloodraven showing up at White Walls and just having Daemon Blackfire II arrested because he was beneath Bloodraven. He wasn't worth, the single combat. So Orys gives him that honor. And then, of course, Orys treats Argilac kindly with grace and marries her. And this all provides continuity of rule for the Stormlanders so they can accept the change in leadership. They're all like, well, he's wearing an antler hat. I mean, how bad could he be? And so, although Orys was not the most rebellious Baratheon, he did seem to have the right touch for the challenges that he faced. So then after the conquest, there's something called the First Dornish War, and that's in 4 AC. This is the one where Orys and his army of Stormlanders are most unfortunately ambushed and trapped by the Will of Will in a mountain pass in the Bone Way. The Will of Will at that time had the notorious nickname of the Widow Lover, and he massacred Orys' entire army except for Orys and a few other lords who were potentially worth a ransom. The Will held them captive for 3 years until he finally got his price. However, he also cut off the sword hand of Orys and all of his men before returning them. After returning to King's Landing, Orys resigned his hand, and yes, he did actually himself make the "I can't be a hand without a hand" joke. So points for self-awareness, but it sounds a little depressing. And indeed, it says that Orys retired to Storm's End and grew crabbed and bitter.
Can't even swing the hammer anymore, damn it.
However, Orys got his chance for revenge. He did. A few decades later, it was 37 AC, and this is the one that involved the so-called Vulture Hunt, the first one, where forces loyal to King Aenys tracked down the Vulture King of House Blackmont in the mountains. House Will is involved once again, and this time it's the son of the Widow Lover, and as his armies were besieging the castle Stonedance, the seat of House Swan, Orys Baratheon was able to smash his armies beneath those walls and take the son of the Widow Lover captive. Orys promptly cut off his sword hand as repayment, and then his other hand, and then both feet, which he called his usury, which means interest, or in this case, revenge. Now, Orys did die on the journey home, but supposedly a happy man, content as he stared at the hands and feet of Widow Lover's son hanging from strings in his tent like a set of onions or something like that, which is pretty gangster. So we'll up his rating a couple of points from whatever it would have been previously. All right, one of my little stubby candles has finally bit the dust, so I did a little rotation, only 3 candle flames, to talk about Rogar Baratheon, who is actually the grandson of Orys Baratheon, and he's definitely a prototypical Baratheon, huge, muscled like a bull, and a born warrior, and also a huge boaster and a feaster as well. I mean, he did oppose Maegor's reign, which is cool, and Rebellious, but he did not immediately rally behind Aegon the Uncrowned, saying instead that Aegon needed to prove his strength. The only thing Aegon proved is that a smaller dragon like Quicksilver has no chance against a huge dragon like Balerion the Black Dread. And of course, I'm talking about the battle over the God's Eye, where Maegor and Balerion made short work of Aegon the Uncrowned and Quicksilver. Rogar did shelter a teenaged Jaehaerys and Alysanne, as well as their mother Alyssa Velaryon, when they fled Maegor and the Red Keep. So that's certainly rebellious, and Rogar Baratheon was the first one to declare for King Jaehaerys. This was late in Maegor's reign as his power was waning, so Rogar's declaration set off a kind of domino effect of other High Lords declaring for Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys then named Rogar Hand of the King and Protector of the Realm, so technically this was Jaehaerys and Rogar launching a rebellion together. So then after Maegor's mysterious death on the Iron Throne, which apparently was kind of a letdown for Rogar, who, had been boasting of how he was going to cut down Maegor in single combat with his axe. He had a double-bladed axe, which he often said was sharp enough to hew through a dragon's neck, as if he was going to try. So anyway, when Maegor died, some people actually thought that Rhaena, that's the rider of Dreamfire and the older sister of Jaehaerys and Alysanne, should take the throne herself. However, Orys Baratheon argued on behalf of Jaehaerys, likely because he would retain a lot of power if Jaehaerys was the king, because he wasn't old enough to be king yet. He was still in his minority, and so would have needed Rogar to stick around and be Hand of the King, and again, have a lot of political power. It was Rogar and Queen Dowager Alyssa Velaryon who essentially ran the kingdom during Jaehaerys' minority, with Jaehaerys sort of sticking his nose in and increasingly asserting his power, which is what he was supposed to do. You can't let the counselors run that shit forever. Now, Rogar turned into kind of a giant pain in the ass from here on out, it must be said. He and Alyssa thought to try to arrange marriages for Jaehaerys and Alysanne, whom they did not want to incest marry one another. Apparently, the plan was to marry Jaehaerys to the buxom, blue-green-haired daughter of the Archon of Tyrosh. Don't blame me, I'm just reading what it says. It's not my fault she sounds like a really fun person. And then Alysanne was to be wed to... I see. Rogar Baratheon's son. Now, Jaehaerys and Alysanne caught wind of these problems and basically eloped to Dragonstone with their dragons and a few of the Kingsguard and got married anyway. Rogar and Alyssa followed to Dragonstone to try to convince them to annul their incestuous abomination marriage. But Jaehaerys threatened their soldiers with his Kingsguard, and Alyssa convinced Rogar to return to King's Landing. Rogar didn't take that too kindly, though. He felt humiliated, and he wanted to get more troops and go back to Dragonstone and storm the keep. And if you're wondering what his plan was to deal with the dragons Vermithor and Silverwing, he didn't have one. And in fact, Alyssa had to remind him, hey, my children have dragons. And so Rogar was again talked off the ledge here. But then a couple years later, Rogar and Alyssa come up with this plan to send the so-called wise women as ladies in waiting to Alysanne. And in actuality, they were septas who were on a secret mission to influence them, again, against abomination incest marriage. And just so we're clear, Jaehaerys and Alysanne are like 13 and 14 at this time, so even though they've married, they haven't consummated the marriage yet, and so it can still be annulled. And that is what Rogar and Alyssa are aiming for. Now, among those wise women septas was one who was not a septa, Corey Ann Wilde. She is the subject of that book, A Caution for Young Girls. And basically, Corey Ann was personally selected by Rogar to try to seduce Jaehaerys. And if that sounds creepy to you, yes, some tales say that Rogar didn't just inspect Corey Ann Wilde, he actually slept with her too. But you know who didn't sleep with her is Jaehaerys, because he's true blue and loyal to his lady love, who's also his sister. Anyways, it's romantic.
Abomination.
And so the plot failed. And after it became obvious that this plot wasn't working, Alyssa basically said, hey, you know what? We're just going to have to accept this. Only for Rogar to aggressively berate her at the small council, calling her weak and sentimental, which is a real lark for someone who had been through as much as Alyssa Velaryon and who had done as much to hold the kingdom together during Maegor's cruel, awful, mismanaged reign. Check out my video, Maegor did not save House Targaryen. It was actually Alyssa Velaryon and Rhaena and Jaehaerys and Alysanne and Rogar who put the kingdom back together after the wars that Maegor had started. And after Maegor had eroded all of his political power, check out the video, the arguments are strong. It's actually a straw man conversation that I have with Rhaegar, but it's entertaining, and I'm right. So yeah, Rogar teeing off on his wife in the small council, and he had a plan. He had another brilliant plan. He wanted to try to crown the daughter of Rhaena Targaryen, Arya, and start another Targaryen civil war, which everyone else thought was really stupid. Alyssa, in fact, demanded her husband's resignation as Hand. And the small council quickly backed her up, so Rogar ended up slinking back to Storm's End, like a bit. And yet, he wasn't done, and I'm kind of getting sick of talking about this guy, but on the way out, he tried to kidnap Arya so he could go through with his plot to crown her at Storm's End. When this failed, he came up with another idiot plan. He sent his brother Oren Baratheon with a few troops to the Mother House of the Faith in Oldtown to try to kidnap Arya's younger twin sister Rhaella, who was a novice of the faith. So as you may recall, Arya and her twin sister Rhaella, they had switched places as kids, so that the one who wanted to be a septa could be, and the one who didn't want to be didn't have to. It was kind of an open secret, but it seemed to be working for both kids, so they just went with it. And so yeah, what Rogar is trying to do here is he wants to force the poor girl who ran away from King's Landing politics to join the faith, to come back to King's Landing and sit on the Iron Throne, presumably to be a puppet queen for Rogar. So this plot was foiled by armed septons, no less, which is kind of cool. And at this point, Rogar saw that he was out of gambits and resigned himself to face Jaehaerys' wrath. He pleaded for mercy for his younger brother Oren, who he had sent to Oldtown and who was captured, and essentially tried to take the blame on himself. And he even named his other brother Borys as heir. And essentially Rogar was preparing to take the black or even be executed. Jaehaerys eventually summoned Rogar to King's Landing to face the music, and although Rogar showed up planning to just ask to join the Night's Watch, Jaehaerys forgave him instead, although he did take him to visit Vermithor up close and personal, as sort of one of those subtle mafia-style shows of power. Jaehaerys then charged Rogar to reassume his place as Alyssa's husband and to, treat her well and not berate her in the small council. So it seems that Rogar mostly did that, although he did get Alyssa with child twice, which was a big health risk because she was, getting up there in age at that point. Their firstborn was Boromund Baratheon, who was then named heir of Storm's End, so sorry, brother Borys. Now it's Boromund. And their second child was Rhaenys, the queen who never was, whom we saw on House of the Dragon. And actually, we saw Boromund too. He's the one who swore fealty to Rhaenyra early on in season 1, back when she was still just a girl and Viserys was king. Now, unfortunately, when Rhaenys, the queen who never was born, there were birth complications. And actually, this was the situation that House of the Dragon adapted and sort of moved over to create the death of Aemma Arryn. So we're not going to go into all the details, but it was basically the exact same situation. So when Jaehaerys got word that his mother was on her deathbed, he showed up to Storm's End, but found Rogar drunk and afraid to look on his dying wife. So that's pretty cowardly, and when the Maester said, hey, I could save the kid, but it's definitely going to result in the death of Alyssa, Jaehaerys forced Rogar to say the words and make the decision. Now, Rhaena, who again is Jaehaerys' older sister, Rider of Dreamfire, she showed up at Storm's End just after her mother died, and she was pissed. She grabbed Boros by his beard, accused him of killing her mother, and threatened that if he were to ever take another wife, she would come and make Storm's End a new Harrenhal. So we're almost done with Rogar, but he got into one final war 7 years later, and it was actually named after him. It was called Lord Rogar's War. So that's pretty cool if you're a Baratheon to have a war named after you, even if it isn't Robert's Rebellion. That's still something. So you remember Rogar's brother Borys, who had been briefly named his heir, but was then moved down the line of succession when his son Boromund was born? Well, he was pissed about that. He actually fled Storm's End in a rage. And then 7 years later, he turns up to join a new Vulture King down in Dorne. This is in 61 AC, and they begin raiding the Stormlands. So Borys is raiding his former homeland just out of, bitterness. In any case, Rogar, whose maesters had told him that he was now dying from some disease or condition, we're not sure, he decides he wants to try to go out with a sword in hand and a curse on his lips like Argilac Durrandon. And so he joins the new vulture hunt, along with Jaehaerys and Vermithor. And it was actually Jaehaerys who stepped in to slay Borys Baratheon so that Rogar didn't have to do it himself and become a kinslayer, which is, of course, a great dishonor. Now, when the Vulture King himself was captured a month later, Lord Rogar struck off his chains and challenged him to single combat, and then slew him easily with his double-bladed axe. So I guess he was disappointed not to have died in battle, and he had to settle for dying in his bed 6 months later. But still, that's pretty fucking hard to go out killing another Vulture King when you're old as shit. All right, thought that section would never end. Thanks for not skipping, by the way. For a palate cleanser, let's talk about the Laughing Storm, Lyonel Baratheon. And yes, we are skipping Boros Baratheon, whom I mentioned at the top. He's the guy from House of the Dragon who reneged on his father's promise to support Rhaenyra, because pretty much all the other stuff that he does besides that, we will see on Season 3 of House of the Dragon in just a few months. And I really want to get to Lyonel and Robert before this video is as long as the Ashai video or the Bloodraven one, which I just made last week. Thanks for watching, everyone. Now, I did also do a big Lyonel video a few weeks back, so check that one out if you missed it. And basically, I was just celebrating his Sir Nunos-ness, so it was a lot of fun. Now, as much as I do love the show Lyonel, I think he's great, there are a couple of things from the book version of Lyonel that some of us readers have been missing. Sir Lyonel Baratheon also fought several notable matches. Against lesser foes, he would often break into booming laughter the moment they touched his shield, and laugh all the time he was mounting and charging and knocking them from their stirrups. If his challengers wore any sort of crest on their helm, Sir Lyonel would strike it off and fling it into the crowd. So it's kind of like the Westerosi equivalent of stealing hood ornaments off of cars, from back when having hood ornaments on cars was a thing. Not sure why they didn't think we'd enjoy seeing Lyonel fling some helm crests into the crowd, but alas. I could have done with a little more laughing in the middle of combat too, but they did more or less nail the spirit of the character. And I'm glad we got to see the more serious, deadly side of Lyonel in this final episode, even if he is clearly wrong about Baelor not risking anything. I mean, the guy died. So clearly there was some level of risk. But as you've seen already with this history, the Storm Lords should always be taken seriously and never for granted. They are among the few houses in Westeros that can credibly challenge the power and authority of House Targaryen. And of course it was King Robert who sent their dynasty packing.
Gods, I was strong.
Therefore, it's no laughing matter, if you will, when Lyonel starts talking about there's a war coming. That might be less of a prediction and more of a case of I just might start a war in the next couple of decades or whenever it strikes my fancy. And start a war he did. A small one anyway. It's really more of a cry for attention than an actual rebellion. But yes, in 237 AC, so almost 30 years after the tourney at Ashford Meadow, Lyonel was initially quite thrilled to betroth his daughter to Egg's eldest son, Duncan, Prince of Dragonflies. That would mean that his daughter would be a future queen of Westeros and his grandson a future king of Westeros. Except for that Duncan then ran off in the woods and fell in love with and married Jenny of Oldstones and chose to marry her instead of remaining heir to the throne. You know, the exact choice that Book Rhaenyra had when she could have chosen to marry Harwin Strong, her true love, except for that she would have had to give up her claim to the throne, and so instead she begged to remain the heir and agreed to a loveless political marriage with Laenor Velaryon. And the rest is history, as they say. In any case, Duncan tapped out of being heir to the throne and also out of marrying Lord Lionel's daughter. And this left Lord Lyonel just as unthrilled as he had originally been thrilled. He picked up his warhammer, renounced his fealty to the Iron Throne, and declared himself the Storm King, like the Durrandon of old. And here is all we know about what came next. A short, bloody rebellion ensued, ending only when Sir Duncan of the Kingsguard defeated Lord Lyonel in single combat, and King Aegon gave his solemn word that his youngest daughter, Rhaelle, would wed Lord Lyonel's heir. To seal the bargain, Princess Rhaelle was sent to Storm's End to serve as Lord Lyonel's cupbearer and companion to his lady wife. See, I told you, Lyonel just really missed Sir Duncan and wanted to cross swords with him one more time. And by this time, this really was a couple of old guys trying to relive their glory years, you know? I mean, they're in their 50s and 60s, so probably most of the people in the yard are just hoping that no one gets hurt. Like, oh man, what's Grandpa doing? In all seriousness, though, it does say short but bloody rebellion, so probably some innocent villagers and men-at-arms and things paid the ultimate price. But I'm not sure how serious of an attempt to break away from the Iron Throne this really was. Although, one never knows with Lyonel. Perhaps if he had defeated Dunk in single combat, he would have decided that his cause had been proven just by the gods and the ancient stags and the rules of the joust and whatnot. In any case, Chase Stone's art of this confrontation is probably my favorite depiction of Baratheon armor, so feast your eyes. And of course, these events do directly lead to Robert, Renly, and Stannis all claiming the throne 4 decades later. As a dying Maester Aemon says,
Stannis had some of the dragon blood in him, yes. His brothers did as well. Rhaelle, Egg's little girl, she was how they came by it. Their father's mother. She used to call me Uncle Maester when she was a little girl.
In other words, Egg's Rhaelle is the grandmother of Robert, Renly, and Stannis, which Aemon goes on to say initially gave him some hope that, maybe Stannis actually was Azor Ahai reborn. He is technically of the bloodline of House Targaryen. And as you may recall, this Targaryen blood was also used as kind of a political pretext for Robert making a claim on the throne, although, as he says, it was really more about his warhammer.
Gods, I was strong.
So that's about all we got for Lyonel, although I will just add that it was kind of rebellious for Lyonel to join Dunk's side in the first place. Just like Dunk said, anybody fighting with him and against the crown risks the anger of the crown. And even though that was less true once Baelor joined Dunk's side, you could see that Lyonel did have fun, not only going after the Kingsguard, but, wailing on Maekar a bit too. Anyway, let's finish with King Robert, and then we will rank our stubborn Stormlords and crown most rebellious Baratheon. Okay, it's time to talk about King Robert Baratheon. And as I mentioned earlier, even though Duran Godsgrief is the first chronological Storm King, his legend is entirely constructed as part of the backstory of Robert, Stannis, and Renly. It's meant to frame them as the heirs to this uniquely stubborn heritage. And George's world building pretty much always works like this, so the deep world building essentially functions as extended backstory for the main characters. So everything that George ever wrote about Valyria is essentially just Dany's backstory. And it's just the same with all these historical, rebellious Durrandons and Baratheons that George has since garnered in after inventing the characters of Robert, Stannis, and Renly. So all these historical Storm Kings are just here to help us better understand Robert, Stannis, and Renly, and maybe Gendry, and whoever else. And Robert really does set the tone. You know, when we meet him, he's already 15 years down the road of heavy drinking and debauchery. And he arrives at Winterfell praising the joys of summer's indulgences. But at the same time, Ned's memories of Robert are giving us a clue about what this demon of the trident was really like back in his day. And this quote is from that chapter where Robert is arriving at Winterfell. 15 years passed when they had ridden forth to win a throne. The Lord of Storm's End had been clean-shaven, clear-eyed, and muscled like a maiden's fantasy. 6.5 feet tall, he towered over lesser men. And when he donned his armor and the great antlered helmet of his house, he became a veritable giant. He'd had a giant's strength, too, his weapon of choice a spiked iron warhammer that Ned could scarcely lift. In those days, the smell of leather and blood had clung to him like perfume. Now it was perfume that clung to him like perfume, and he had a girth to match his height. Now it was perfume that clung to him like perfume is one of George's best lines in all of A Game of Thrones, in my opinion. And as many have pointed out, Robert's warhammer is really way too big. Common warhammers really weren't much bigger than regular hammers, and they were intended to be wielded as one-handed weapons. So what George is doing is he is presenting Robert like kind of a Marvel character. And Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, obviously leaps to mind here. It's so heavy that only Thor can lift it. That's definitely what George is going for. Although even Mjolnir is not that big, so Robert's warhammer is larger than life, as is Robert himself. And the point is, I don't think you want Robert hitting you in the chest with that sucker. So then later when Ned is sitting in the black cells and contemplating his life, he remembers Robert as a god. He found himself thinking of Robert more and more. He saw the king as he had been in the flower of his youth, tall and handsome, his great antlered helm on his head, his warhammer in hand, sitting his horse like a horned god. He heard his laughter in the dark, saw his eyes, blue and clear as mountain lakes. So there's a little concept preview of the character that would become the Laughing Storm, if you will, who is of course just a permutation of the Baratheon Stormlord archetype that George has basically fashioned from a combination of storm gods like Thor, Zeus, and Marduk, horned gods like Cernunnos, Dionysus, and Bacchus, and of course, Conan the Barbarian. So as for Robert's Rebellion, well, there's a lot to say of it, and I am of a mind to make a dedicated Robert's Rebellion video, so let me know if you want to see that. I was thinking about doing it soon since, I don't know if you heard, but the Tourney of Harrenhal stage play is getting set to hit the stage this summer in the UK. So we may actually get some lore drops on just what was going on at Harrenhal. And so yeah, I was thinking about doing a Robert's Rebellion video before that sometime soon, so let me know. But just to sort of briefly highlight what kind of a problem Robert really was on the battlefield without going all the way deep into the motivations and politics that set up the war, let's go ahead and take a minute to talk about all the shit that Robert fucked up with his Warhammer. And I'm sorry for all the cursing. It's a rebellious Baratheon stream. I'm rebelling against the YouTubes. I know I'm censoring myself actually, but whatever. So the first battle is Goldtown, and this is kind of where Robert's reputation is really created. Jon Arryn had called his banners to war after King Aerys had demanded the head of Robert and Ned following his brutal and cruel murder of Rickard and Brandon Stark. But Lord Grafton, who was one of Lord Arryn's bannermen, remained loyal to the crown instead. And this set the stage for conflict, of course. So here is Lord Burrell again, Lord Godric Burrell of Sweet Sister, describing the impression that Robert made with his deeds at Goldtown.
By then we knew that Jon Arryn had taken Goldtown, though. Robert was the first man to gain the wall and slew Mark Grafton with his own hand. This Baratheon is fearless, I said. He fights the way a king should fight.
So try to imagine all the medieval battle scenes that you've ever seen in a movie where people are trying to storm the wall. It doesn't look like fun, does it? I mean, climbing ladders is already hard, and a little bit dangerous. And that's when people aren't throwing rocks and dumping boiling oil onto your head, shooting arrows at you, and all the rest. This kind of thing is fun for Robert, though. It's almost like a race to reach the top first. So not only did he reach the top of the walls first, he then killed everyone who was trying to kill him while he beat a path to the single most protected man on the battlefield, Lord Grafton, and slew him. And technically slay or slew, that's kind of a sword word. Robert probably smashed him upside the head, but the point was it was pretty metal, and it impressed people like Lord Burrell. So next comes Summerhall, where Robert actually won 3 separate battles in one day. And what had happened was Lord Caffrin, Fell, and Grandison, who were loyal to the king, planned to join forces at Summerhall and then march on Storm's End. However, Robert caught wind of their plans, got the jump on them, and went to Summerhall to fight each army in turn individually before they could join up. This worked, and Robert won all 3 battles. And then he won over the captured lords to his side, and they started fighting for him during the war. Next, Robert lost an indecisive, as it's described, battle at Ashford, and this is the same Ashford as the tourney of Ashford Meadow from the Hedge Knight, and ended up wounded in Stony Sept and essentially being hunted down by the forces of the new hand, John Connington. So this is the one where John Con turns the town upside down searching for Robert, but the townspeople are hiding him and moving him and basically just vexing John Con. And then, of course, later John Con thinks, well, Tywin would have burned the whole thing down to get Robert. This becomes the Battle of the Bells when Ned and Jon Arryn arrive with their armies, and the bells are rung to let the townspeople know to lock their doors. Robert won the Battle of the Bells and almost killed Jon Con in the fighting, which, really could have saved us a lot of trouble and also a huge grayscale epidemic that's about to hit King's Landing in the Winds of Winter. So next comes the decisive Battle of the Trident. We don't really need to go over that. The main thing is that Robert smacked Rhaegar with his warhammer and in fact drove the iron spike into his breastplate, spilling out his rubies into the River Trident, with that ford being then renamed the Ruby Ford. Gods, I was strong. And in doing so, Robert Baratheon brought to an end the 300-year-old dynasty of House Targaryen, thereby becoming the only rebellious Baratheon or Durrandon to rule all of Westeros. Now, Robert also stopped by the Iron Islands 6 years later to absolutely f*** their shit up, along with Ned and a few other people that you might know, such as Thoros of Myr, Sir Barristan Selmy, and Sir Gregor Clegane. Now, Balon Greyjoy's father, Quellen Greyjoy, had actually declared for Robert and fought for Robert's side, but he died in the Battle of the Mander towards the end of the war, leaving Balon to stew and brew up a rebellion. Balon began by attacking Lannisport and burning their fleet. Then he tried to attack Seaguard, the seat of House Mallister, but failed. Then came the counterattack from the Iron Throne. Stannis defeated Victarion's fleet at sea, and this is the big loss that Victarion is still sort of twisted up about in A Dance with Dragons. And this victory allowed Robert to cross the sea and land troops on the Iron Islands, which he did. Robert and Ned destroyed the castle of the Botleys and the town of Lordsport that lie beneath it. Then they went on to Castle Pike, where they destroyed part of the outer wall and the south tower with siege engines and opened up the gap for all the troops to pour in, and they took the castle. Now, conquering the Iron Islands, that's pretty hard. That's something only a couple people in history have done. So you can really get a picture of Robert's iron will here. We've seen weak kings like Aenys kind of dither and delay when faced with a little small local rebellion, but not Robert. He rode right out there and smashed that thing down with the help of Stannis, who does deserve a big hat tip. I mean, it's hard to defeat the Greyjoys at sea. And so that is pretty much Robert's resume. And just to say a quick word about Stannis and Renly, well, they rebelled too. They also rebelled against the Iron Throne and against each other. Technically, that's more of Renly trying to jump the line to rebel against the throne before Stannis. And obviously, Joffrey's rule is illegitimate, but they didn't just go along with it. They went to war about it. The stubbornness of both Stannis and Renly is certainly on display in their parley. And Stannis, of course, goes on to very stubbornly persist with his claim to the throne after Melisandre's shadow baby, I guess it's Mel and Stannis' shadow baby, takes care of Renly. And also Courtney Penrose, rest in peace. Now, Stannis is his own video topic. I actually did an Ultimate Stannis video with literally everything I have to say about Stannis in it. It was originally a live stream. I took it down and edited it and added pictures. So that's pretty much the complete package. Check that one out if you want more Stannis. So now all that's left is to rank all these horny folks. So let's go ahead and do that. And don't forget to let me know if you want to see a Robert's Rebellion video. All right, we're back. Thanks for watching the video, everyone. Let's rank these friggin' Durrandon and Baratheon fractious, rebellious, recalcitrant, most problematic, most troublesome antler hat wearing dude. Let's go. Starting with number 10. I've got Duran III, who we didn't mention after the intro, but he did invade Dorne twice, like I said, and that's pretty stubborn to invade Dorne the second time after you failed the first time. Number 9, Orys Baratheon. Like I said, kind of a conformist, but he did win some wars and stuff, and cutting off the hands and feet was pretty metal. At number 8, Rogar Baratheon, who, again, more of a boaster, more of a shit talker than a real doer, but he was certainly stubborn and recalcitrant and problematic over a prolonged period of time. And that shit trying to steal Arya on the way out of the Red Keep, that was just wiling out. And so was trying to steal her sister from Old Town. That was just crazy. So then at number 7, I've got the Laughing Storm. Again, his rebellion wasn't that serious, but I can't put him any lower because he's just that cool. Then at number 6, we've got Argilac the Arrogant. Not the sharpest, you understand what I'm saying? It was pretty dumb to provoke Aegon like that, but it was also very stubborn and ornery, so number 6. Then at number 5, I'm calling that a two-way tie between Arlen I, the Devourer, and Arlen III. And those are the two guys who expanded the Storm Kingdom to its largest extent, and the Old God's wedding to Lady Blackwood goes hard. Number 4, I've got Duran the 21st, because that Weirwood Alliance thing is really cool, and they were totally outmatched against the Andals, so that's some real balls to the wall stuff to win a bunch of battles against the Andals. And Storm's End was never conquered, so take that. At number 3, I do have Ronard the Bastard. I mean, not only for just the countless battles, and I'm not giving him points for debauchery, but it's very Baratheon-like. And I mean, what's more rebellious than usurping your half-brother by marrying your half-sister? And that was just really messed up. So this is one of the most rebellious and warlike and lecherous Baratheons. Ronard the Bastard. Learn the name. Number 2 is King Robert. Not a lot to say except for, he toppled the Targaryen dynasty and was the ruling king of all of Westeros for 17 years. Yes, Cersei did put horns on him per se. And yes, he left no issue of his body, besides a bunch of bastards, of course. We love you, Gendry. We love you, Maya Stone. We love you, Edric Storm. Somewhere out there rowing in the narrow sea. Let me know if you want an Edric Storm video. I've actually got a prediction for him. Anyway, yeah, King Robert, number 2, which means that number 1 can only be Duran Godsgrief. He defied the gods. I mean, come on. He did the whole Monty Python cast. You know how tiring it is to build 7 castles? And then he's getting help from the Children of the Forest. He's taking the Rainwood from the Children of the Forest. He's wearing antler hats like the Green Men. I mean, he started the whole tradition, so yeah, number 1, Duran Godsgrief. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you soon with another video about something. I've got a whole bunch of videos on the way, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss a video, so YouTube knows you want to see my videos in your feed. And please do leave a comment on the way out and let me know how you would have ranked these rebellious Baratheons.